Here, and I welcome everybody. This is the coffee hour session on reviewing and publishing behind the scenes being organized by ARO Education Committee. My name is Jarnail Singh, and I'm a member of Education Committee and currently work as research instructor at SI School of Medicine. And today I will be moderating this session on behalf of Education Committee. In this session, we will be discussing mainly about the journey of a manuscript, right from the submission to a journal till its final publication in that particular journal. For this discussion, today we have two amazing speakers from Mass Eye and Ear and UMass Chan Medical School. And our first speaker is Dr. Judy Kempler, who obtained her medical degree from University of Ulm Medical School in Germany and started her clinical training at the University of Tübingen Medical Center in Germany. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the field of inner ear regeneration with Dr. Albert S. at Mass Eye and Ear before she finished her residency and fellowship training in otolaryngology and otology or neurotology at Mass Eye and Ear and in Germany as well. Dr. Campbell currently holds a research appointment in the Eaton Peabody Laboratories at Mass Eye and Ear and a clinical appointment at UMass Memorial Medical Center. In her clinical practice at UMass, Dr. Campbell treats all otologic disorders in pediatric and adult patients, including sensory neural hearing loss, chronic ear disease, and lateral skull-based disorders. And she is on the editorial board of Otology and Neurotology Journal. Dr. Campbell's focuses on regenerative approaches to improve sensory neural hearing loss, employing innovative techniques of cellular reprogramming, gene therapy, and small molecule drug development. She had a special interest in Schwann cells and glia of inner ear and the auditory system and their role in repair and hearing restoration. Welcome, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone.
Another speaker who joined us today is Dr. Andreas Eckert, who obtained his medical degree from the University of Tübingen Medical School and the Hearing Research Center, Tübingen in Germany. He got trained as a postdoctoral fellow in the otopathology laboratory at Mass Eye and Ear before completing his clinical training in otolaryngology at the University Hospital Zurich in Switzerland. As a resident and junior consultant, he completed clinical work at interdisciplinary centers for vertigo and balance disorders in Munich, Germany, and Zurich, Switzerland, respectively. Dr. Eckert is currently an assistant professor in Department of Pharmacology at Mass Eye and Ear, and is also a co-director of otopathology laboratory at Harvard Medical School. In both his research and clinical work, he has pursued a strong focus on vestibular disorders. His research interests are the cellular and molecular pathomechanisms of inner ear diseases, foremost Meniere's disease, with special interest in pathogenic roles of non-sensory supporting cells. His group seeks to develop and implement new diagnostic and therapeutic approaches for vestibular disorders, utilizing methods ranging from basic animal models to translational patient-based approaches with a dedicated focus on integrating human otopathology research. Dr. Eckert's clinical work is strongly informed by his research and revolves around diagnosing and managing patients with vestibular and combined vestibular and auditory symptoms. Welcome, Dr. Andreas.
Thanks, Janai, for the introduction. Hello, everyone.
And now it's over to you about this session, Dr. Andreas and Dr. Judy Campbell.
Yes, welcome everyone again. We would like to tell you a little bit about reviewing and publishing and what happens behind the scenes. And I think we can only do this if we also briefly talk about how to write a good manuscript. And this is what I will start out with. Before you put together a manuscript, you should ask yourself a few questions. First of all, of course, is it worth writing? And what should be the format that you want to write it in? All different journals have various options for articles. That could be a review, could be an original article, could be a case report or a meta-analysis. But then what is the right journal for your work? And who would be the audience for this? it has helped me in the beginning a lot to talk to my mentor, or to talk to colleagues about how to pick a journal and how to learn more about this journal. And then lastly, it may also be influenced by the impact factor of a journal, especially internationally. The impact factor for a last or a first author can be quite important in order to rise up in your academic rank. And then next, I usually ask myself the question, how does that work that I've done fit into the existing literature? And you should do a literature search in part before you start a project, and then while you're working on your project, and then before you write the manuscript. What is known about the topic? What are the open questions? And what's the knowledge gap here? Why is this information very important? And how can your work set yourself apart, that research, from what has already been published? Also ask yourself again, what is the audience that you want to address it to? Is it someone that is in the hearing field, or do you have, for example, if you work on inner ear regeneration, do you want to address someone in the that has a stem cell background? And then what message do you want them to take away from your writing? How could you write it best to address your readers? And all the journals do have on their website the mission statement and also submission guidelines that can already be very helpful in the beginning when you're starting out to put together your manuscript. A brief word on the impact factor and the H index, just to clarify. So the impact factor, that is the number that is given to a journal for the frequency with which the average article in that journal has been cited in a particular year. So it measures the importance of a journal, and it's calculating the times these articles have been cited. The H index is different. So the H index quantifies your own scientific research output, and it measures your scientific productivity, and then it also measures your scientific impact as a scientist. And based on your most cited papers, this H index is created, and the numbers of citations that you have received through other people's citations. It's hard to find what is a good H index, and it varies greatly depending on the field of research. I found one website where they mentioned that an H index score between 3 and 5 is common for new assistant professors. Scores between 8 and 12 are more standard for someone that is a new associate professor, and then anything above 15 or 20 is what a full professor has. But I think there are certain institutions where you need much more in order to move up the ladder, but this is an average view of what I found. Now let's go to the first paper drafts. The title page. That's something that I start with early on. I would also recommend to do that early, and that should include picking the authors for the manuscript and picking out who is going to write what for your manuscript, who is helping with what. You want to establish these responsibilities early on and make it very clear to then avoid any hurt feelings of people that wanted to be included or that didn't get included as an author or in the wrong position or only in the acknowledgements. And for the process of writing, create an outline. It can be very basic, few bullet points. What do you want to have in there? And decide on how you want to share that with your colleagues or your other authors. Are you using a Dropbox folder? Are you using Google Docs? Do you like when someone is working on the manuscript at the same time? Do you like to have different versions? And you're going to have multiple drafts, especially if it's a scientific paper, often more so than in a clinical paper. Make sure you have a good file name. Make sure you organize that well so you can always find the most recent draft again. And consider which tables or figures you want to make, even if you don't have them all put together yet. Just have an outline of that and do that early on. It'll tell you very quickly if there should be more analysis that goes into it or if there's something that's redundant. And then start with the easiest first that you're writing. For me, that's usually materials and methods. Oftentimes it's a method that I've already done for another publication, so it's easier. And then I usually move on to the introduction and then results and then the discussion last. And it helps to have a deadline, and it's okay to set regular meetings with your co-authors to make sure that things are not hanging around in orbit for a long time and nothing is happening. The abstract is like a mini paper. It should have usually a little introduction with background. It should mention the methods, summarize the results, and then have a mini conclusion discussion that again summarizes the impact of what you have done. The abstract also requires a lot of drafts, and it's sometimes even harder to summarize what you've done in some very concise sentences. So to me, it's easiest to write the abstract last, but everyone's a little bit different. If you want to write that first, I guess that also works, but be prepared to revise it accordingly. The introduction, that's the first bigger background part that you're going to write that should draw the audience in. So you want to have an impactful statement in the beginning that tells them what it is that you're looking at. And you can be provocative there and make sure that it targets the audience of the journal that you're submitting it to. You want to early on mention what is the gap in knowledge, and then you want to talk about what you're going to do in order to solve that. But you want to start broad with your background to give them the research and context, and then you're going to narrow that down a little bit more to the specific question that you are asking for your project. You should point out why it is important for the field that you're trying to answer this question. And if there's a specific method that needs to be better explained, you can give some background on that too, if this is a major part of your study. In the introduction, you're also going to have most of your references in there. This is where you give them the relevant literature and the background on that. And if you haven't done so yet, obviously you would want to familiarize yourself with in-text citations in a program, for example, like EndNote. And then at the end, you're addressing your hypothesis or your question again, summarizing what you're going to do in the upcoming methods and results section. It helps to compartmentalize the methods, including subheadings, and for each method have a separate paragraph. And this needs to be written clearly enough so that also a person that's not directly in the field could understand what you have done. So you have to have enough information in there. And then it should also have enough information so it could be replicated. If it's a very, very detailed protocol, part of that can go in the supplement depending on what the journal requires, but it really should provide enough information so that someone else could follow that and do the similar experiment. It's very, very hard if it's a method, for example, like immunohistochemistry that has already been published a gazillion times and everyone does it. So you don't want to copy exactly a method from someone else or from your prior paper. You have to write it again in your own words. The goal rule is always do not use more than like 4 consecutive words from another publication. You don't want to copy them. So you have to change it around a little bit. And usually methods are written in past tense. You can use active and passive voice, and then your statistical analysis should also go into that part. On to the results. The results should always be organized around your actual data. That means the tables and the figures that you have planned out. And usually results are written in past tense, your own results. And active voice is always stronger than passive voice. So use active voice as much as you can. It makes your overall manuscript much more impactful in terms of a writing experiment. The results section is not the part where you're going to interpret your results. You're only describing your findings in a very objective manner, detailed enough so that everyone can understand what has happened and how this has led you to the next experiment. This is also the part where you'll figure out which graph or table, figure or data is going to go where, what you want to start out with, and what you're going to end with in order to show your data the most effectively. And what is absolutely necessary. And you may find that some of your figures that you had planned out may do better in the supplement and may not really tie well into the story that you want to tell in your manuscript. And at each bottom part of your results section or results paragraph, you want to have one summarizing sentence in the end that, again, just briefly talks again about the data set and what you have done in that section. I found that very helpful. I've seen that often done, and I really like that style. Some practical tips for your figures. Figures should simplify your message and your data, and it should not overcomplicate it. There are different ways to organize your data. Everyone likes it a little bit differently. It also depends on the data, but oftentimes people have a design flow that goes from the left to the right so that the eye can naturally follow, or you go from the top to the bottom. And then sometimes you could potentially do it in a circle. I've personally never done that, but it's another option. Your most important data may either be figure 1 or should also be the focus of your figure design. You want to make sure it stands out and that it gets the space that it needs in order to most effectively underline what you're describing in your results. If there's any excess data, excess text, if you have a lot of labels, if the labels are too small, if the figure gets overcomplicated and people cannot easily follow the experiment, then I would remove that. You want to make it as clear as possible and as easily readable if they look through the results and then follow with the figure. The text should be large enough. It's oftentimes a mistake that people have a bar graph and then the axes labels are extremely small and no one can see them, and you have to zoom in quite a bit. So they can be overly large because it helps to very quickly follow the results, even if the actual bars are then smaller in comparison. And similar to immunohistochemical data, you want to make sure that the colors of what you've stained for, that they're boldly labeled in the figure so that everyone can see what is what marker. Reduce the contrast of bold lines. It's usually not helpful, and remove anything that's repeated elements in there. Shadows are never a good thing. They just distract. Oftentimes they're not necessary. You want to clean up your figure as much as possible. And then the colors, that's an important point. It depends on whether you need a lot of colors. Some people do, and in that case, you may also wish to publish in color, but oftentimes journals charge more if you publish in color, and you may get away with it if you do it in black and white, and then plan accordingly for that so that people, even if it's black and white, can distinguish the different bars from each other. If you have to use colors, limit the number of colors. Less is more usually in order to get your point across and so that it's not like a psychedelic picture. Avoid red and green in general, because there are always readers that are color blind and that will have a more difficult time understanding your figure if everything is just red and green. Here are a few examples of what you should probably not do with your figures. And if you look here on the left side, I wonder if this one at some point was planned to be in color. It was published in black and white. The labels are quite small. Everything is sort of juxtaposed on top of each other here. You can barely make out which line is which, especially down here. You can't see anything. Same here. This is very hard to interpret. And again, the figure should underline your results and should make it easier for you to understand the data. This is a very difficult graph to interpret. I'm sure there would have been much better ways to plot the data. Be careful with 3D graphs. This is also one where even if you want to show it in 3D, you should maybe put in less or make it a little bit more visually better presentable, because I can barely read what is what that is in the legend here. And then you have to try and understand which circle is which, what are the different axes here. There are no labels on either side. Not a good way to show your data. You want to have an effective figure that better explains what you're writing. This is really not the way to go. That's very confusing. Also, if you do see a true difference, make sure you point that out. But if there's no real difference, you should also show that accordingly. Here it looks as if the red and the blue graph are very far apart, but if you look at the axes, it's basically from 67.4 to 69.2, and they're only 1 point apart. There is probably not a lot of difference here, so this is not the ideal way to show the data. That can be very confusing, or it can lead to false interpretation. And then lastly here, comment on the colors. Well, if you can, use colors that are not both green or not that close together. This could have been highlighted much better with like a light and a dark color, or with two opposing colors rather than using green 2 times. For the discussion and conclusion, the first paragraph, again, is where you answer the question or your hypothesis, where you tell them what you have done to solve this question. You summarize and you emphasize especially your positive findings and outcomes. There's the sandwich technique. You have something positive in the beginning and you end your discussion with something positive. There will always be pros and cons, and you have to discuss them. This is the time to also interpret your data. But any limitation or any negative results that you have, pack them more in the middle and end on a positive note. You have to provide evidence for pro and con, your interpretation there, and ideally, if you can, underline that with some additional literature to show what fits your data or what may not, and then also the implications of your findings. But be conservative with that. You don't want to overstate. The reviewers will pick up on that. If it's all speculation and you don't have any data to back it up, it's not a good thing. And point out if you had other findings in your study that you did not expect, or some new findings that you also want that are somewhat unrelated, but that you want to bring up. And then your last paragraph is going to be the conclusion, where again, you summarize again what you have achieved and what you have done. Some additional tips, we've already mentioned that throughout. Tenses, you can use past and present. When you're quoting somebody else's previously published work, more often that is done in present tense, so you can refer to it. For example, this here, penicillin treats strep throat. But when you're describing your own work, you usually do that in past tense. You say, we tested a new antibiotic for strep throat. And then proofreading is huge. It's going to be very important because that's the most annoying part for the reviewer. If there are a lot of little mistakes, grammar mistakes, wrong labels, things that could have been picked up on by proofreading, that then the reviewer has to go through. So it means if you use abbreviation or terms, are they used consistently throughout? People, if they have different labels for their controls, or then they abbreviate it, CTL, or they write it out, and it's always different on each figure, that's not a good thing. Standardize everything, make sure you use everything consistently. Do your numbers in the figures match the numbers in the text and the tables? Make sure that that correlates, that it's always the same. Again, do the citations in the text match the references, and then are your syntax and grammar okay? If you're not a native speaker, it's not a problem. There are professional editing services that you can send it to, and they will help to edit that. It goes a huge way for a reviewer when they see that it's overall well written. It's much more enjoyable to read that, and you're getting less annoyed as you're going through it. And then reread your, even if it's version 32, reread it often, and you may have to take a break in between, put it aside and come back to it. Or maybe you give it to someone else to look at it with fresh eyes. And then if there's any constructive feedback, try to incorporate that. That can really make a difference in the end. And just a brief note on getting back the reviews. Officially, the reviewer is always right. If you get comments back, you have to address them. Whether or not they're right, it's another question, but you have to address the comments and assume that what they're saying for the most part is correct. But you don't have to respond quickly. Don't make any rash decisions. Look through the reviews, talk with other people about it, and see how you want to respond to that, or whether you need to do additional experiments. And in case you get rejected, well, was it sent out for a review even? Do you get any comments back? If it was not sent out for a review, you can consider changing the type of journal, or if you don't get any changes back, you can also move it on to another journal quickly, see if that helps. But there's this 3-journal rule where if you get rejected 3 times, you should really think about, from different journals, you should think about whether you want to do additional experiments, if you need to do a different analysis. So you should look very critically at your publication. And then as we move on to reviewing a paper, it will happen to you sooner or later that you get approached to review, and you can either accept or defer. And I think especially in the beginning, it's great to review as many as you can, but be aware whether it's going to be helpful for you or not. So it's most easy to review if that paper is within your scope of expertise, because you know the literature better, you understand the methods. But if you're very busy with another manuscript, life gets in the way, maybe you have exams or something else, then don't accept it if you can't put in the time, because it is a significant amount of time extra, and you also want to do a good job with it. Nobody likes it when you just get one sentence back from a reviewer. And then now that you're on the other side, you know what it's like when you submit a manuscript and you get the reviews back. You hope for helpful and constructive reviews, and you should provide the same to others. So it should help them, even if it's a bad paper, give them some constructive criticism. And it's a really great learning experience for you. You understand other papers better, you get to learn the literature, and you learn how to interpret data and provide a review for that. There are, depending on the journal, different formats of reviews that are preferred, but for the most part, I think it's pretty flexible. I've done best with a structured approach where I have a checklist to go through, and I'll show you a little bit about how I review. One of my very basic checklists just goes over some primary questions. Is it overall well written? Does the hypothesis make sense? The question that they want to ask. Do they have proper methods to address that? Do they have a control group for that? Are the analyses appropriate? Do they provide all the statistics for that? And then does the methodology actually answer the question that they're asking? And then in the discussion, do they balance it between interpreting their own results and then adding some speculations, which you should in the discussion, but it can't just all be speculation and you have nothing to back it up with. And then I look at the quality of the figures. When I start out a review, I start with a summary statement. That means to the editor and to the authors, I have one paragraph that summarizes again what they have done in their manuscript or in their paper. And it mentions the goals of the paper, briefly, the methods and the results, and then the overall message and the outcomes, whether it made sense. I try to have a general comment that says, well, this is overall a good paper, or this is a very weak paper, or these are the strengths of the paper, so that for the editor, it's very easy to understand the main flaw or the main potential of that manuscript. And then I have a little novelty section, and that's the part where then I, especially if it's not exactly my background, this is where I do a literature search. I look through the literature and try to see, has this already been done? Has it been done in another context? How novel is their approach in that field? And what makes this manuscript unique compared to what's already been shown in the literature? And that can just be a few sentences. And also if I feel that references are missing, I oftentimes put that under that section and say the author should also look into these publications. And then I go to some specific comments. And this is where if it's not present, and you'd be surprised, sometimes it's really not present, I ask for the authors to provide continuous line numbering. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for you to review that. If you always have to say, this is on page this and that, I think it was line number here, and then you have to quote everything. Having line numbering is essential. Then I look at overall style, syntax, and grammar. Is this overall well done? Do I think this is a non-native speaker? And if needed, then I will recommend that they send their manuscript to a professional editing service in order to help with all these things. I can correct a few commas or spelling mistakes, but you can't rewrite the paper for someone where the grammar and the style are just not appropriate. And then I look at the actual methods and the results, and I go through paragraph by paragraph, and I put some comments for myself on this side. I mark out things. I usually refer to the specific line, and you can quote certain parts for the authors to reference to. I also briefly check the abbreviations. Are they all explained in the beginning, written out, and then are they used correctly? And also sometimes you find papers where there are so many abbreviations, too many, that it gets confusing because you don't remember what each of them were, or they're very similar. Then I also look to see, are there ways to simplifying that a little bit? I comment briefly on the statistical analysis and the methods in detail. Is there anything missing in terms of experiments or methods that should have been done? Are they inappropriate to answer that question or that hypothesis? And then do they mention limitations? Are these the correct limitations? Are there others? And do they provide the correct references? So everything that should be on your checklist before you send it out for publication is basically what, as a reviewer, you will also go over in your own checklist. So you'll see if you have all of this already done beforehand, it's going to be a much more positive review. And then I look back at the figures and tables, and it's the same comments again, things that I pointed out as weaknesses. Are the colors helpful? Is it confusing? What is the size of the axes? Can I read the labels properly? Are they incorrect or missing labels? how appropriate is a certain table or chart or figure? Should that better be in the supplement, or should it be shown in a different way to be more effective? And then I suggest that as improvement. If you are reviewing a terrible paper and you'll come across of them and you'll find yourself being very annoyed with what other people try to publish, do you have to be nice? Well, I would say you don't have to be nice, but it needs to be professional and appropriate. And you have to provide an objective review, some that you would also want to get back. Here's one bad example. There's a website where you can look up all the worst reviewer comments. And a bad one was, this is clearly a submission that needs to be shredded, burned, and the ashes buried in multiple locations. Well, that's just, it's really depressing for the author to get a comment back like that, but it also doesn't provide you any constructive criticism, right? So how can you learn to be better with a comment like that? Very good papers are rare. You may come across them, and then the review will be very easy. You may only recommend minimal revisions because they've checked all the other boxes of your list, and overall the review is going to be shorter. But for the most part, you'll get mediocre or good papers, but there's still a lot of work to do. And that also means your review is going to be a lot more work, because you have to be more detailed in the things that you point out, right? There may be more different methods to still address certain questions in order to bring this in the end to publication. Very bad papers you'll also come across, and they're not enjoyable. It's a little bit a question of whether or not you want to provide a detailed review here. If it's absolutely terrible and it really doesn't fit the scope of the journal that you're reviewing for, then you can make that shorter and reject it, but you still have to offer some suggestions for improvement, or at least comment on why you would like to reject it. Or you can put in a little bit more work and bring it to maybe a point where they can be considered after major revision. And then just to summarize here, I have some other best worst reviewer comments that we can go over briefly. One here, for example, by now there are over 1,000 articles on this topic, but these authors have not read a single one. Right now, there's zero rationale for the study and zero reason to read the study. The standard of writing is impeccable, so much for grammar. I would have very much liked to read the article promised in the abstract. And the paper descends into nonsense, never to return on line 44. All of these are true reviewer comments that you can find online. Can be entertaining, but sometimes it's crushing if you are the author. And hopefully there's some additional positive suggestions then for you. Here are some references that I've used that you can look over if you want to, and then I'll pass it on to Dr. Eckhart with more information on the editorial process. I'm going to stop the sharing here.
Thank you, Judith. So I'm just pulling up my slides. And I continue to talk now a little bit about the black box of the editorial process. So Dr. Kempfler gave you basically the tools of the trade to write a coherent and impactful manuscript. And your quest as an author is now to use these tools to convince, as the first person, the editor that your work is worth publishing in the journal you submitted to. So why is understanding the editorial process, why does it matter? I'm talking here from my own experience. I'm an associate editor with ARO for a little bit over a year now, and learning about that process and engaging in that process, I can say has helped me write better, I think. And just being aware of all the steps that happen on the side you as an author do not directly interact with help to plan better and foresee issues better. So demystifying the black box helps in publishing and reduces anxiety to deal with parts of the manuscript writing and the whole submission process that you are in the beginning, especially as a junior researcher and writer, not really aware of and might procrastinate a little bit for these reasons. I think we all did and do this. I think the tasks of an editor can be nicely summarized with a headline: editorial ethics. Each journal publishes and trains their editors in editorial ethics. And from most journals, I know those guidelines are an iteration of the COPE, Committee on Publication Ethics Guidelines, which can be looked up on their homepage. This is actually a quite informative read. So major tasks of the editor are to maintain the journal's reputation for ethical standards and keep up fair processes on the side of the authors and the reviewers. Task is to ensure that intellectual property is respected, so that work that is already published is cited where it's due, and that research integrity is maintained, so that the ethical protocols and are in place when work that is being submitted. It is also an editor's responsibility to avoid any bias in the editorial decision-making process. So, for example, I, as an editor, would not be handling a manuscript that is submitted to JARO by someone that works or collaborates with me. That also falls under the category of ensuring, as far as possible, that papers meet ethical standards. So I broke this process up a little bit now. After you wrote your manuscript and you think it's in good shape, you're submitting it. This happens usually via an online submission system, Scholar One Editorial Manager. And when you go to these homepages, you'll see that there are different login options. Often you can log in as an author, as a reviewer, or as an editor, and sometimes even as a publisher. So editors use the same platform to access your submissions and handle them. I want to point out one document that you usually prepare together with your manuscript, and this is the cover letter. And I personally think the cover letter is very important, and since I'm an editor, I put even more emphasis on it. That's the first document I usually read as an editor. And like Judith pointed out, how much work you should put into writing an abstract, you should consider the cover letter as an abstract that you tailor to the editor. So you briefly highlight the scope and the impact of your work and relate it to the scope of the journal to convince the editor that this is a good and impactful fit for your journal. Keep it concise. I usually have my cover letter as a one-pager. You submit all the other required files, and then a question that often comes up, when and where to submit. And as Judith has already pointed out, this can be very specific to preferences. It is very differently handled in different labs. So I want to say much about it, but this is just a diagram I found in a paper. They correlated accepted and rejected number of papers as a function of the month from January to December. And if you take this year for granted, if you want to consider it, then my recommendation would be you better enjoy the Christmas holidays and you're getting to work now and submit your manuscript, because chances in January and February are the highest that your paper gets accepted. First step after submission is the editorial office check. There's a technical check that happens first, which is usually not handled by the editors themselves. This is more a formality check. Is the submission complete? Have you submitted all the different parts of your paper in adequate file formats? And did you adhere to the formatting guidelines? That's an important point. When the journal has, for example, a word count limit, you should strictly adhere to that word count limit. That can be a knockout criterion for your manuscript right at the initial stage. Continues then with a scope check. So does your manuscript actually fall into the scope of the journal? And that's very interesting, specifically for JARO, the Journal of the Association for Research in Otolaryngology. As the title of that journal suggests, it is a otolaryngology journal. So I can tell you there are a lot of submissions for papers in the head and neck cancer research field, but this is not the scope of the JARO journal. You can look it up on the homepage. JARO is pretty much focused on publishing articles in the auditory research field. So you should check this and really make sure there are no misconceptions about the scope of the journal before submitting to it. Then a submission gets taken over by the editor-in-chief or the handling editor and is being assessed. And the cover letter, again, is an important first tool to do this, to check for novelty, significance, the potential impact. And if the editor deems this a good fit for the journal and makes the decision to send it out for peer review, common reasons for a rejection at this stage are either that the scope of the manuscript of the submitted work is not fitting the scope of the journal. A presentation, for example, the figures or the overall grammar of the writing is not adequate, might also be a knockout criterion at that stage. The first task now of the editor in handling the manuscript is to select reviewers. And for everyone who is fulfilling editorial tasks in any form knows that can be quite a long process. Finding reviewers can be difficult. You know, we're all pretty busy, and especially in grant writing cycles also on, it can be really difficult to find 2 or 3 reviewers to handle a manuscript. What helps is having a peer network. When the manuscript that has been submitted is in your direct field of expertise, you know a lot of people who can handle this manuscript and who also are not too closely related to the group that submitted that manuscript, because then there would be a conflict of interest. If you have exhausted your peer group, or the work that you are handling the manuscript is a little bit outside of your direct field of expertise, and you do not know exactly what researchers would be appropriate for handling this manuscript, there are reviewer databases out there. Every publisher or the major publishers curate their own reviewer databases, and they are more or less proprietary. So you get access to these databases only when you are an editor working for that publisher. Or you could also just go to Google Scholar, Web of Science, SCOTUS, and other databases to find people who work in the respective field. When you have identified reviewers, you're sending out invitations, and sending out invitations usually also happens through the submission platform as a standardized process. I would quickly want to say something about the different types of peer review processes. First one is the single blinded process. I would say this is dying out, or I don't see it that often. That would be a process where the reviewer knows the authors, the names of the authors or the group that submitted, but the authors do not know the reviewer. The second process would be a double-blinded process where neither the reviewers nor the authors know each other's name. And the third process, which is becoming more and more popular, especially in the more recent open access online publishing platforms, is an open peer review process where the names of the authors and reviewers are open and public from the beginning, with the intent to foster a more open and respectful communication. So 2 questions editors often have to deal with. What happens if a reviewer doesn't respond So usually there's a time limit for the reviewer to complete their review and submit it back via the submission platform. And if this hasn't happened in time, then usually as an editor, you have to reach out and find another reviewer. And this, of course, then prolongs the entire review process. The second, it can be more difficult question an editor has to deal with. What happens if reviewers disagree? Say the journal guidelines stipulate that 2 reviewers review a manuscript, and one reviewer is really happy, raves about the manuscript, and the second one is very negative, suggests major reviews or even a rejection. So you get back as an editor 2 opposing reviews. Either you as the reviewer are the tip at the scale and you make a final decision, or more often a third reviewer gets involved. I would say many journals also involve 3 reviewers from the get-go. Types of editorial decisions, Dr. Kempfler already talked about it. Getting accepted right away, I would say, is a unicorn. Has not happened to me. That's why I labeled minor revisions here in green. I think this is kind of the best case scenario. Major revisions and reject. I'm not going to go into details here anymore. Dr. Kempfler also talked already about what if my paper is rejected. I think it's important to reiterate common reasons for rejection are not always a reflection of the quality of the research itself, especially in print-based journals. There's a certain number of publications per issue or volume that can be accepted. And it might be that just the demand for that specific volume was satisfied, or other reasons on the publisher side that have nothing to do with the quality and the impact of your paper itself. In general, you should also take the feedback, learn from it, and as Dr. Kempfler said, use it to improve your manuscript if you feel appropriate, and go on and choose a more suitable manuscript or journal. And finally, what if my paper is accepted? Well, then congratulations, and we hope it hasn't taken too long to get to this point. And with that, I think I want to conclude here and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Andreas and Judith, for such a detailed and nice presentation about manuscript writing and what are the processes that needs to be taken into consideration right from submission through publication. Now we open floor for questions from the audience. We have 10 more minutes left. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box or unmute yourself. Thank you.
Andreas, you as an editor, you would have the final decision. Is that correct? You look at what the reviewers then send to you. Are you very, do you also review again, or do you rely on everything that the reviewers send to you?
Yeah, I was not in a position or situation so far where the editorial decision-making process got difficult. So yeah, I was taking all reviewer comments as they were and forwarded them to the authors.
And for the most part, do all the reviewers agree, or is there someone that says accept and someone that says reject? Does that happen often?
In my experience, not. No. Discrepancies like minor versus major revision, I would say, is the most common. And this is also like a question of definition, right? You write your comments as a reviewer, you submit them online, and usually at the end of the submission process, there's a checkbox, minor or major revisions.
Right.
and how you label them as a reviewer might be very different. So it is subjective, and so in my experience, I saw reviews that in my eyes were minor revisions, but they were labeled as major, or vice versa. That can also happen.
I have a question regarding desk rejection. Basically, like, does editor go through the whole manuscript or just like read the abstract? Like, how much time an editor spend before making decision whether this will be desk rejected or go for peer review?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think the answer will vary from editor to editor. Again, from my experience, the cover letter is, I think, very important. But of course, you go beyond that. You, as an editor, you certainly read the abstract, other critical parts of the manuscript. I think you're not diving into the discussion, but you certainly look at the figures and the results of the overall style of writing and the presentation. But again, the idea or the task as editor is to make a judgment whether the manuscript in general is fitted scope-wise. And the judges, the more objective judges, are supposed to be the reviewers. So I think you should be rather liberal in forwarding these manuscripts to review if the scope and impact is met, but that's a high threshold.
There's also this time limitation. As an editor, you get hundreds of manuscripts that you have to look through, right? You only have so much time. That's why I agree the cover letter plays an important role. You don't even have the time to do an in-depth review as much.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And my perception is, especially the more recent, the newer online publishing platforms, they tend to engage more editors. Like when you go to the homepages of some, I don't want to name any, but some journals, you see very long handling editor lists. That might be also maybe also to spread the scope a little bit, but maybe also to narrow a little bit the workload for individual editors. That's just a speculation.
What is your advice on like reviewing, particularly for the people who are reviewing it, a manuscript for the first time, or like are new to this area of review process, but they are like very good researchers in their field?
I think having a checklist is very helpful so that you comment on all the different aspects of a manuscript, not just whether or not the data is good, but you have to check other boxes too, right? Whether it's references, whether it's the grammar and the style. And I think a checklist in the beginning helps in having sort of an outline, as I mentioned, something general and then something more specific.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to add here, I mean, when you learn about a new method as a researcher, you do it with someone more experienced, right? And I think the same should be the case for peer reviews. When you're very young, it's also less likely, or actually quite unlikely, that you get invited right away to write a peer review. So I tend to do this together with younger lab members in the beginning. And there's also, I think, a good policy to then resubmit it and mention that this review was done together with a junior researcher. Yeah, I think that's a fair thing to do, and in my experience, is often accepted. I think what should not happen is that if you are invited to do a review, that you just forward that task to one of your lab members, so that at the end, another person, someone who was initially not invited, does the entire review and is not even mentioned, not even credited for the work they did.
Let's just say that's happened to me more than once. Yes. That's in a way how I learned it too, as you're saying, but yes, you get something forwarded because it's a lot of work for someone else. You have to do the work.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. Do you think publishing reviews alongside the paper in an open peer review is changing the way people review the papers?
It's a good question. Well, I hope it would, and I hope that people are giving more constructive criticism and you don't find as many comments anymore as I have shown. But I have not personally seen a lot of difference there. Have you, Andreas?
I'm not sure I have enough experience with that process, but I think it certainly, I think it can help, taking out an emotional component of this process. When you submit your work and you read, it was a lot of work preparing it. You get reviewer comments back, and you perceive them maybe that they are inappropriate. So I think both sides are becoming more aware of their language in the review process because it's out there and open, and it is a permanent track record on the journal's homepage. It becomes basically part of the paper. So I think I'm in favor of that.
I agree.
Is there anyone interested to ask questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, sorry.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Do you hear me as an echo?
Nope.
No?
No, okay. So, thanks for the insightful presentation. So I was actually kind of curious what both of your opinions are in terms of some of the reviewers that gets published with the paper. So some are like I don't think Jaro does this, but eLife actually does this, where the reviewers actually comment during the reviewing process, and that review also gets published with the paper. And so I'm just kind of interested in what your thoughts about, that model compared to the more traditional model.
I think we just talked about this. Kelsey had asked a fairly similar question. And I don't know if you heard, but we were both in favor of it. Hopefully it'll, as Andreas was saying, makes things a little bit more objective and less emotional, and avoids poor language on the reviewer's side, and overall leads to a better review process.
Oh, apologies. I think I actually missed, but thank you.
All right, we have just 1 more minute left in case somebody has question. Otherwise, we can conclude the session. No more questions.
There's one question. Could you please reiterate what you put in a cover letter? Andreas, maybe you want to comment briefly on what you think is the most important.
Yes. So again, I would say my approach is I consider it as an abstract tailored to the editor I'm submitting it to. So I go to the journal's homepage. There's usually a little blurb about the scope of the journal, and I am making sure that I am relating the key findings of my study to the key scope points. Sometimes I'm literally copy pasting scope points into my cover letter, and I'm addressing them in my cover letter. Really make sure I'm hooking my manuscript to the scope of the journal and emphasize its impact. Hope that answers the question. You don't have to go into the details of specific results, of course.
Seems like we don't have any other questions so far. I would like to thank both of our speakers for this wonderful presentation and the nice discussion we had. Thank you so much for joining us today I would like to also thank our attendees today to make this coffee hours successful. Thank you so much.
Janai, thank you so much for
Okay.
Thank you, Jarnail. Thank you, everyone. This was really great.
Pleasure to
Bye.
be here. Thank you.
Bye-bye.